Okay, so let's begin with these, with this email, with these two questions. Question number one, does God have a sense of humor? Question number two, can you talk about the mikveh and about non-married women or men going? Okay, two very separate questions. Does God have a sense of humor? Absolutely. The question is how you define a sense of humor. The sense of humor means that he knows how to infuse joy and laughter. I think that's God's purpose, or at least one of his purposes, to infuse joy and laughter, and for us to find it in everything, to find the happiness even in sadness, to find the laughter even when people are in soured moods. That's our duty, to find God's laughter everywhere. Now, if you're referring to humor per se, and what I mean by humor per se is that let's just analyze this for a second. What makes a joke funny? Anyone? What makes a joke funny? What makes humor humor?
Punchline.
Thank you, Daniel. That's right. It's the punchline. Why is it the punchline? Because it's something that we don't expect. Wow. Oh, wow. That's funny. That's shockingly funny. That's what makes a joke happy. So God, I think, uses his sense of humor all the time. So many times we plan our day ahead or our few hours ahead, and they don't come out. Something out of the left field comes and hits us and rocks our world. That's God's sense of humor. That's his punchline that we didn't expect. So I think every day from that standpoint, from the humor per se, again, from that standpoint, God exercises his sense of humor and gives us a punchline that we didn't expect. And those who are fortunate have many punchlines. And our duty then is just to open our ears, our hearts, our minds, in order to understand what God wants from us. And if we're able to really become in tune with God's plan, then we too will laugh. We'll laugh at his joke. We'll laugh at his punchline. So that's another aspect of God's sense of humor.
I am God's punchline.
Sorry?
I'm God's punchline. I am his punchline.
Okay, I think everyone is. Okay, good. All right. And number two, can you talk about the mikvah? So yes, absolutely. We can talk about the mikvah. The mikvah is probably the most important mitzvah in Judaism. And I'm not exaggerating. In fact, it says that a community should build a mikvah before it builds a synagogue. Should build a mikvah even before it builds a house of study. Should build a mikvah before it builds a school. Do you think education is important? Mikvah is even more important. Why is that? Because mikvah is that symbol, or much more than a symbol, but it's that mitzvah, really, that good deed that enables us to go back to the very foundation of creation. When we dip in the mikvah, and it's particularly when women dip in the mikvah when they have to, then they go back to their mother's womb. In our mother's womb, we were surrounded by water. And in the mikvah, we too are surrounded by water. And then we come out and we are born again. That's where the Christians stole it from. We're born again. And we are like new creatures with new blessings, with new lights. And Kabbalah speaks a lot about those new lights that come down a person after they go to a mikvah. Now, why is that so important? Because it takes us out of our boredom and of our regularity of life, so to speak. When a person lives life as if he's just floating and he enters this cruise control that he can never really come out of, then his life is purposeless. His life is also meaningless, and the life is not a life. And when a person can stop, once a month, women do this, and men, again, Hasidic men do this every day. Men can do this more often, but it's not really a mitzvah. It's more of a custom for men, but for women. But the idea of the mikveh remains the same. And when a person can stop and say, no, I'm going to jump out of the mode I am in right now. I'm going to go back to my mother's womb and recreate myself and look at life anew as if I've never seen it before. Then a person can create newness also in life. Then he can imagine going home and saying to your spouse, look, I've never seen you before. This is like I'm falling in love with you again. It's like when I first met you, when I first saw you. Life is completely new for me because I was just born again. That's the brilliance of the mikvah. it's also one of the oldest mitzvahs, no doubt. It's you know, the mikvah is, the idea of the mikvah is found even before the giving of the Torah, but it's this element in our lives that enables us again to recreate life time and time again, look at life from a completely new perspective, receive completely new blessings and lights as mentioned, and therefore also create newness ourselves. That's really the big idea of the mikvah. Now, you know, the many halachas, many laws that are attached to the mikvah. For example, one cannot have any separation. You can't go to the mikvah with a bathing suit. You can't have any separation between you. You have to be completely like you were in your mother's womb. So no separation between you and the water. Some have the custom that when they dip, this idea goes as far as saying that when you dip in the mikvah, this is true for men too. When they dip in the mikvah, you have to lift your feet above the floor a little bit so that the water can enwrap you fully. Because if they stall on the floor, then the part of your foot that is touching the floor won't be enwrapped by water. It's touching the floor. So you have to lift your feet a little bit. You have to make sure that you're completely enwrapped. There are other laws, of course, that relate to mikvah, how many times you dip and so on. But these are already technicalities. But that is really, I think, the main idea of the mikvah, enabling us to reboot life, to press that reset button and then create newness ourselves.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Okay, so what about women that are not married and are past their, you know, they don't get their periods? Wait. And the other question I have, I always have a lot of questions, but the other question I have is, even if you have a mikvah, can you go to the water, like to Lake Michigan, or can you go to running water instead of a mikvah?
So that's going into the halachas a little bit more, right? So what is that's the question. What's considered to be a mikvah? A mikvah is really in a sense of rainwater, of spring water or rainwater, God's water, not man-made water, but God-made water. And for example, here at CBT, the mikvah is really mikvah of rainwater. Now, when you dip in the mikvah, you really are dipping into tap water. But there is a pit. There are actually 3 pits of rainwater attached to the pit that you're dipping in, to the pool that you're dipping in. And because they're attached to that pool, so when you're dipping into that tap water, it's considered as if you're dipping into rainwater, because the majority of the water that really is found is rainwater. It's attached to the tap water again. So now, with that in mind, it answers the question that you posed. Yes, you could go, theoretically speaking, you could go to the sea, to the ocean. I mean, you have to be modest. You have to make sure no one sees you. But you can go to the ocean to go to the mikvah. You can go to any other God-made type of water, not man-made. You can go, for example, I think to Lake Pleasant. I think that's man-made, or other, sources of water that are man-made. You can go to God-made water and dip there also. Now you have to have certain quantities. You have to have 40 se'ah. That's the halakhic measurement, which is quite a bit of water. Forget the exact amount. I don't want to throw just a number, but it's a lot of gallons. In addition to that, also the mikvah itself has to be a mikvah that never came into contact with dead animals or other impure sources. Even though there's halachic discussion about that and whether that mikvah that did come into contact with the dead animal is considered to still good or not. You also have to check the mikvah constantly to make sure that nothing broke. That, for example, that the rainwater is not evaporating or that there's no leak. And then you won't have enough rainwater and you'll be dipping really into tap water, and that's no good. So anyway, there's a lot of technicalities. Now, the first question that you asked was regarding women that are past menopause or even before they get married, whether they should go to the mikvah. Absolutely. There's a mitzvah for all women to go to the mikvah from their wedding onward. If you didn't go, if you were never married, or if you didn't go, and then you have menopause and you don't have to go technically to the mikvah anymore, you can and should still go to the mikvah at least once. Again, because we want to reset our lives at least once. And also it brings tremendous spiritual powers also. Now, if you're before your wedding, I know rabbis, many of you know him, Rabbi Zinger, Rabbi Dov Zinger, the head of Rabbi Stein's high school yeshiva, who was in our community a few times. He was here for the grand opening. So his wife takes bat mitzvah girls to the mikvah to familiarize them with the special mitzvah and also to bring upon them even more purity. There's nothing can go wrong by going to the mikvah. Even if you're not commanded to go like a married woman, only goodness and purity can come from going to a mikvah. So absolutely, it's encouraged. Yeah. Okay. Next question. So this is a question more about the topic that came up yesterday during our class about the afterlife. And the question is this. It's a long email, so I'm trying to shorten it. But so it's a question basically about cremation. Let me just shorten it. Why is it so prohibited in Judaism? And are there any rooms to allow cremations? Is there any room to allow cremation in Judaism? So we touched upon this in the class yesterday, but it's worth repeating and it's worth also developing this idea. So cremation is completely prohibited. No, there is no room to allow it in Judaism whatsoever. And not only that, but it's considered to be also one of the grave sins that a person, God forbid, can commit. Now, why is that? So cremation, now, I'm of course talking about intentional cremation. Let's keep in mind that unfortunately throughout our history, and particularly not too long ago in the Holocaust, Jews were burned to death. That was against their will, and these Jews are as holy as it gets. And they, God forbid, were never punished because someone cremated them. They was against their will, and they died al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. So I'm not speaking about cremation against your will. Of course, I'm speaking about cremation that you intentionally commanded. Now, why are we so against it? So there are multiple reasons. Let's go over some of the reasons. Number one, because our body is not ours. We mentioned this yesterday. Our body is not ours. We can't decide what to do with our bodies. And it's the same idea why we can't have tattoos, why we can't cut ourselves, why we can't use our body in any derogatory way. Why? Because our body is not ours. It's God's. And just like I'm not allowed to go to my neighbor and take his chair without permission because it's his chair, so too I'm not allowed to go to God and take his body and do whatever I want with it because it's not mine, it's God's. That's number one. Number two, we spoke about the mystical aspect, and that is that the body and the soul live together in this world. We're all a combination of body and soul. After a person dies, the soul leaves the body, but it's still in a way in a relationship with the body, especially if they live together. If a person lived a long life, they lived together for a long time, then it still it treats its body as its spouse, if you want to use that analogy, as its counterpart. Now, when the soul leaves the body and it sees that the body is being burned, the soul suffers tremendously because it's seeing its spouse being burned, completely disrespected. And that brings tremendous agony to the soul. So that's another reason why we're against cremation in Judaism, more of a soulful reason. A third reason of why we're against cremation, and that's because it goes to a whole other aspect, and that's because there's a mitzvah to bury. There's a mitzvah for the loved ones that remain alive to bury the deceased. That mitzvah is also part of respecting your parents or respecting whoever it may be in your family that passed. It's your mitzvah to do it. And the reason is because we want to create a respectful resting place for that person. If I just go and burn something, that's disrespect. I mean, if I respect something, I don't burn it. I actually try and polish it all the time. You know, think of items that you have at home. If you have items that you respect, you don't just burn them. You don't burn them. You throw in the bonfire what you don't want. So burial is part of showing respect for that person, for that body. And we say, okay, we respect you. We're not just going to burn you. We respect you. And therefore, we're going to treat you with dignity. So that's yet another reason. And a fourth reason, which goes back now to the mystical aspect, is that we truly believe that our bodies too have some divinity, are permeated with God's holiness. That's why we say, B'Tselem Elokim bara et Adam, that God created man with the image of God. That image of God is part of our body. It's what our body reflects. When we cremate a body, we are burning a piece of God, so to speak, because the body, in a sense, carries some of God's holiness. And therefore, we out of respect for God, of course, we don't burn the body. So yeah, you have multiple reasons why cremation is so prohibited in Judaism. Now, again, and I've said this often, it's a subject I'm passionate about. And if you know of someone that is thinking of cremating himself, or the discussion is found in your family, I'm happy to speak to that person directly. I know I received an email this week, and I'll reach out to that person too. But again, I'm happy to speak to anyone and everyone about this because it's such an important commandment. That's to relate to that question about cremation.
Rabbi Allouche?
Yes.
It's my understanding that now Jewish cemeteries have a place for people that have been cremated.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's it's it's like they say about some institutions that call themselves Jewish. I'm not going to call any names, but say you have a Jewish organization. So people ask, is it more of an organization? Is it an organization that just happens to be Jewish, or is it a Jewish organization? I would say the same thing about those cemeteries. I mean, Judaism is very, very, very clear about the laws of cremation. And to have a section for, I understand, fine, yeah, we want to respect it, even ashes. Maybe bury them in a Jewish cemetery. Maybe that's better. You know what? Maybe that's better. But I wouldn't, as an institution, I would certainly not encourage cremation at all. Now, I will come to say again that I'm not talking about a cremation that has been forced upon us, right? So, for example, when you have those ashes of those 6 million, absolutely, we should treat them like bodies. We should treat them with utmost respect, just like we should treat the ashes of people who are cremated with utmost respect. But I'm not talking about the beginning of the process, right? When we are starting to consider cremation, let's not encourage it, quite the opposite. Let's discourage it for all the reasons that we stated. Okay, all right, next question. This also is in the context of death and dying. So can you talk about Shiver customs? How long is it okay when you go to a Shiver house to stay? What is appropriate to talk about with the mourners? Any special customs like bringing food? Any special customer, man, woman? Okay, so that's a good question. How do you behave in a Shiva house, in a house of mourners? As we all know, that's part of the Jewish custom and mitzvah, that when your loved one dies, if you're an immediate relative, you sit Shiva. For 7 days, you sit and you mourn and you stay in your house and you reflect upon the life that that person led. Now, people are invited to the Shiva. We have services, prayer services at the Shiva. How is one supposed to behave himself? So first and foremost, we have to keep in mind, and I think it's been confirmed by professionals in this field, that the best thing we can do for people who are mourning is just to be there. I know sometimes we have an urge to speak and to converse and to speak about anything and everything from the weather to the deceased. But sometimes silence is exactly what we need. Just that feeling, that feeling that we are present, that we are with the person, is what is most important. So we have to really weigh our words very carefully, because sometimes our words really create an opposite effect and it drains the person. And in a way, maybe even if you're speaking about the deceased, it enhances the sadness and the mourning. So we have to really be very, very, very careful. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Sometimes all we need to do is be present. I know there's an urge to do other things, but just be present. Listen, tell the person that you're there for them, cry with them, be with them, feel their pain. And that's what's most important. That's number one. Number two, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the mourners. And in a way, we have to be able to try and guess what they would want to speak about. And that's sometimes very, very hard to do. But I will say this, I think that, now being exposed to so many mourners, there's one common denominator that all mourners want to speak about. And they want to speak about the positive impact that their loved ones had in this world, or even better, on you. If you have a story like that, I can promise you it will rejoice, it will bring some comfort to the mourner. If you can say, hey, your mother, your father that just died, whoever it was, changed my life and he did this for me, that's something they want to hear. That will bring a lot of comfort. And not only that, I will dare say mystically, this will also bring much nachas, much pleasure to the soul. The soul, we believe, is in the Shiva house, as we learned about yesterday. And it listens to all the conversations. When it sees, when it hears, when the soul hears that it had a positive impact in this world, it brings it a lot of joy and pleasure. So that's one thing that you can say. No, don't speak about the weather, but speak about, again, what they would want to hear. And I'll tell you what all mourners have in common, they all want to hear the positive impact that their loved ones had, either on you or in general on the world. So that's number two. Number three, one, regarding the timing now. One has to be very, very, very in tune, very sensitive with the state, with the emotional state of the mourner. Sometimes the mourner doesn't want you there. They just drain, they're tired, they want to go to sleep, they want to have their own moment. You have to be sensitive to that. I know people love to go and say l'chaim and this and shmooze, and especially when there's food there, Jews can never separate themselves from that. But sometimes it's time to just go. You know what they say? The difference is between a Jew, forget about it. A Jew and an Englishman. I won't say the third person because then I'll be labeled a racist. A Jew and an Englishman. An Englishman says goodbye. And
that one. Yeah.
And the Jew, I forget the story.
No.
It doesn't matter.
I got it. The Russian leaves without saying goodbye.
Yeah, that's why I don't want to.
The Jewish person says goodbye but doesn't leave.
Thank you. Yeah, but in any case, one has to know when to leave. And sometimes, really, if you don't know, if you're confused, should I leave? Should I not leave? If you're in a state of confusion, probably the answer is you should leave. That's regarding the timing to answer that question. One more general thing about how to behave in the house of a mourner, and that is that there are specific customs that the mourner has to be at the center stage. And therefore, any conversation that are idle, any conversation that happens on the side and is not part of should be minimized. It's not part of the mourning itself, because again, the mourning has to take center stage. You have to enter into the mood of the mourner. And therefore, again, yes, try and bring comfort and bring joy. But again, the mourner is at the center stage, not you, not what you went through today, not the news, even though it's I don't know, I haven't followed yet, but it's an undecided election. That's not the subject at a mourner's house, and it's not a subject in general altogether. But again, the mourner takes the center stage. Now, regarding practical laws of how to behave in the house of a mourner, if usually you should remain standing. Unless the mourner tells you to sit down, you should remain standing out of respect for the mourner. Secondly, out of respect for the mourner also, you should not shake his hand or her hand unless they want you to shake his hand or her hand. Number three, you have to be able to try and complete the minions, do anything that they need. So spiritually speaking, and then also materially speaking. So if they need a minion, it's an extra mitzvah to show up for that minion, to complete that minion. If they need, now materialistic needs, if they need food, go ahead, you buy them food. If they need whatever it may be, stools to sit on, go provide those stools for them to sit on. whatever they need, you should try and meet. And then whatever their needs are. Last but not least, also, the mourner also should be able to, there are restrictions on the mourner. So the mourner, for example, cannot work. They can't go and make a living because they have to sit in the house for 7 days. So if they should be able to not, we should try and minimize their worry. If, for example, they are worried in this specific department, oh, I'm not working, I don't know what to do. So then you can try and help them fill that void yourself, or at least give them some feedback about what's happening at their work. Try and minimize their worry in that department of work. Of course, if they have other worries, try and minimize actively their worries so that they can focus on their mourning and on their loved ones. So those are the general things regarding comforting the mourners and how to behave in the Shiver house. Okay. Next question. So this is a different question, but it's an important one. Can you please clear me up on the relationships between Kabbalah, Talmud, Tanya, Zohar, also Old Testament, Torah, 10 Commandments, 613 Commandments? Okay, so it's a question really of knowing your library, your Jewish library, not just knowing the books, but also knowing the timeline of those books. That's what you're asking. And I think it's a very important question because we speak often about the Talmud says and Kabbalah, and we don't really know where it appears and when in history did this book all of a sudden reveal itself. So let's create some order here with all these books mentioned and maybe with a few more too. So Jewish history really begins, I mean, some say begins with Abraham, but really, to be as practical as possible, Jewish history really begins with the Jewish people being enslaved in Egypt. After they were enslaved in Egypt, God gave them the Torah on Mount Sinai. The Torah was given about 3,300 years ago. That Torah was, when I say Torah, I'm referring to the 5 books of Moses, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, as you mentioned here. That's the 5 books of Moses. Now, the Torah, we believe firmly, was given with an oral law. Why? Because it's impossible to understand the Torah without a guide, without a how-to list. Why so? Because, for example, the Torah says respect your parents. What does that mean? Does that mean you have to polish their shoes every day? You have to bring them a cup of water every day? What does it mean? So there was obviously an oral Torah, an oral law given with the written Torah that explain what respecting your parents mean. And the sages indeed teach that oral law says, for example, that you shouldn't sit in their seat, that you can't call them by name, that you you can't raise your voice towards your parents, and many other laws. So, along with the Old Testament, with those 5 books of Moses, with the Torah itself, again, all these are the names, different names for the same book, came the oral law. That oral law remained oral, remained verbal for about 1,000 years, until about 2,200 years ago, when the sages began to transcribe the Torah, write it down. Eventually, that compilation of the oral law written down was concluded by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who lived about in the year about 100 CE, so about 1,900 years ago. And he compiled the oral law in a written fashion that is referred to as the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah does not reveal anything new. Again, it just simply the Torah explained the way it was explained orally by God to Moses when he received that Torah, but it was finally written down. So again, now, this is very important because these are the fundamental books of Judaism. So you have the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, you have its oral law that was there much later on transcribed into written words, and that's called the Mishnah. The Torah, the Mishnah. Now, let's just continue now in that timeline. So the Torah was about 3,300 years ago. The Mishnah was, the end of the compilation of the Mishnah was 1,900 years ago. Fast forward now, and I'm skipping a lot, but fast forward to about 800 years ago, the times of Maimonides. Maimonides said, well, that's great that we have a how-to book, a Mishnah that explains the Torah, but it's all over the place. and a lot of it doesn't apply to us today. So I'm going to create a code of Jewish law. He called it the Mishneh Torah. That is very organized, that speaks of laws that everyone can relate to, and that follows a very specific order. Maimonides is almost like an architect, or like, you know, the ultimate organizer, took the Mishnah and transcribed it into practical laws. 14 volumes altogether, called the Mishneh Torah, or he also called it the Yad HaChazakah, the mighty hand. The reason he called it the mighty hand is not just because it's a mighty book, but the word for hand in Hebrew is Yad, and that has a numerical value of 14. 14 books, 14 volumes to this great composition. So he was really the first one to have to provide for the Jewish people a comprehensive code of Jewish law that is as relevant, as clear, as lucid, as practical as possible, as pragmatic as possible. The code of Jewish law was further condensed about 450 years ago, 500 years ago, by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who lived in Tzfat in Israel. He didn't come from Tzfat, he came from really Turkey, and then via Greece and other places. But he compiled what we know today as the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. The Code of Jewish Law basically takes the book of Maimonides and takes, of course, the Mishnah itself, which is the much greater composition of 1900 years ago, and condenses it even more into 4 volumes this time, not 14, 4 volumes of practical laws. Now, any rabbi who's asked a halachic question usually goes to that Code of Jewish Law to decide what the law is. Now, it's interesting to note, though, that Rabbi Yosef Karo was a Sephardic rabbi, and he wrote a book based on the knowledge of Sephardic Jews, of what the law is. Now, during his times, there was another man called Rabbi Moshe Isserles, also known as the Ramah by his initials, and he lived in France. And he was writing also a code of Jewish law, unbeknownst to him he did not know that Rabbi Yosef Karo was also writing a code of Jewish law at the same time. So there were 2 people writing a code of Jewish law at the same time, one in France and one in Israel, and they didn't know each other, or they didn't know of their writings. Now, Rabbi Yosef Karo finished his book first. And after he finished his book first, he wanted the approbation of many rabbis, so he sent it all over the world. He also sent it to Rabbi Moshe Isserles, asking for his endorsement of this book. Rabbi Moshe Isserles receives his book and he's shocked, because he himself is writing a code of Jewish law. He doesn't know what to do. Now he says to himself, if I publish my code of Jewish law and Rabbi Karo publishes his book of Jewish law, the Jewish world will be divided. There will be 2 Torahs, 2 codes of Jewish law. So I'm going with tremendous courage and tremendous humility. Rabbi Isserles decided, I'm going to bury my book. And wherever I disagree with Rabbi Karo, I'm going to add some notes in his book. And that's why if you look at the Code of Jewish Law as it is today, you'll find the bold letters, the bigger letters, being the letters of Rabbi Karo. And when you see a little note with smaller letters, those are the notes of Rabbi Isserles, where he happened to disagree with Rabbi Karo, saying that Ashkenazic Jews believe we should do this and that, not like you, the Sephardic Jew. So that was a tremendous act of humility that saved really the Jewish people and enhanced their unity. And that's what we follow today. That's the Code of Jewish Law as we know it, the Shulchan Aruch. That again was compiled about 500 years ago. Now, yes, there were many other books that came from there to explain commentaries and so on, to explain Code of Jewish Law. But right now, I gave you the canon of the Jewish library. I forgot to mention one big book, and that's the book of the Talmud. What is the Talmud? The Talmud is really probably the backbone of, so to speak, of Jewish literature. And why am I saying so? Because what the Talmud does is that it takes the Mishnah, remember the oral law that was transcribed into written words some 1900 years ago, and it asks every possible question about it. It leaves no stone unturned. And therefore, it can delve into topics of anatomy, of biology, of zoology, of geography, of you name it, of everything in the world, because it tries to understand not just the source of the Mishnah, but also the logic of the Mishnah. It strives to understand also the reasoning of the Mishnah. It tries to understand everything about the Mishnah and everything about every word of the Mishnah. That's the Talmud. The Talmud is really has many different tractates that again attack every word of the Mishnah, but it's the most comprehensive and all-encompassing book that Judaism has that covers every topic there is in this world, and of course in the Torah. Now the Talmud was written in Aramaic, and it's a much harder book to therefore understand. It's also because of its questioning non-stop. It's associative mode. It jumps from one topic to another. It's a very hard book to comprehend. But thank God, friends, we have Rabbi Steinsaltz, because Rabbi Steinsaltz was the first person who took this impossible book, very complicated and very long book, and made it accessible to each and all. Not only did he translate it from Aramaic and punctuate Aramaic and so on, but he also added his own commentary, added his own explanations, his own clarifications on the sides of the pages. And thanks to Rabbi Steinsaltz, anyone today can access the sea of the Talmud. So that's the Talmud, and that was composed shortly after the Mishnah from about 1900 years ago until about 1600 years ago.
Rabbi, I have a question. Where does Pirkei Avot fit in?
Okay, so Pirkei Avot is a part of the Mishnah.
Oh, part of the Mishnah.
It's part of the Mishnah. Yeah.
That's my favorite book.
Okay, good. By the way, it's the favorite book of the Chinese too. You should know. Rabbi Steinsaltz translated this book into Chinese, and they loved it so much. They found that it was very much in common with Chinese values, that they encouraged all of the schools in China to learn it. And the proof is right here.
What's the name of the book?
This is
It's called Pirkei Avot, which is Sages of our Ethics of Our Fathers.
In Chinese. There you go.
Wow. Oh my God.
Yeah. So
I started studying that with Rabbi Karsh. I mean, that's how I got to know him.
Okay.
And they've used many things from Pirkei Avot in trials, like the O.J. Simpson trial. They used things from there.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. All right. One more book I want to speak about. So we have the Torah, Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, same book. And that was then, and the oral law that came with it, the oral law that was transcribed 1900 years ago, the Talmud that asked every question about this oral law, the Mishnah, from 1900 years ago to about 1600 years ago. Then Maimonides that came and created the first comprehensive code of Jewish law. And 500 years ago, that code of Jewish law was condensed even more into 4 volumes by Rabbi Karo, with Rabbi Isserles adding his notes. That's to summarize everything we've studied thus far. Now, one more book I want to speak about that's mentioned here in the question is the Zohar. The Zohar was most probably written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a Mishnaic sage of again, 2,000 years ago, maybe 1,900 years ago to be more exact, 1,950 years ago. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai composed this book, which is the foremost book and the foundational book of Jewish mysticism, of what we know as Kabbalah. Now, this book remained very esoteric and maybe even mysterious to many, not to the great sages like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai or even like Rabbi Akiva and others. But it finally was exposed and elucidated by Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who lived during the same time as Rabbi Karo, some 450 years ago, also in the same city in Tzfat. They knew each other and they studied with each other. One was very halachic and pragmatic, and one was very mystical and esoteric. But Rabbi Yitzchak Luria took the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the Zohar and developed them and made them accessible to a lot. And of course, since then, there were many Kabbalists too. The Hasidic movement is seen that came with the Baal Shem Tov 400 years ago, seemed to be a direct continuation of the Arizal's theology, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria's theology, also known as the Arizal. and they expound, therefore, much more on mystical teachings. That's the Zohar. And I hope I answered your question.
What about the Tanya?
What about the Tanya? Oh, that's right. The Tanya is also mentioned, yes. So the Tanya, that's a good question. So the Tanya is a part of Hasidic teachings. Now, the founder of the Hasidic movement was the Baal Shem Tov some 400 years ago, and he emphasized mystical teachings as mentioned, but mystical teachings, the way they can be really relate to life. Now, the Baal Shem Tov had many students. Each student emphasized another aspect of his theology, this Hasidic theology, that aimed to bring joy and bring to life Judaism. By the way, it's not a different religion, God forbid. Quite the opposite. It emphasizes the light and the joy in Judaism and the passion in Judaism. But every student emphasized another aspect of the Baal Shem Tov's teaching. One of these students who came as a third generation for the Baal Shem Tov, there was the Maggid of Mezrich, and then the Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He founded the Chabad movement. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, some 300 years ago, founded the Chabad movement. He wrote a book called the Tanya. And the Tanya is considered to be the philosophy of the Chabad movement, which I think is one of the most brilliant books of not just Hasidic theology, but I think of human life. And it's the best GPS for the soul that one can read. And it goes really, the Chabad movement came from the Hasidic tree, and they emphasized the intellectual teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And therefore, this book is also very intellectual. And it's something that we can relate to, but also at the same time, again, it speaks to the soul, to the challenges that a person may face in life, to the evil inclinations versus the good inclination, to the animalistic inclinations versus the divine inclinations, how a person can find some harmony between them, tools that he gives in this innermost battle that we all experience every day. And it's really one of the most brilliant books. So that's the Tanya, authored by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi some 300 years ago. Okay. Let's move to the next question. I believe we have, I think, just one more question. That's about I'm going to try to relate to it as best as I could, about taking the Lord's name in vain. So there is a prohibition in the 10 Commandments that speak about taking the Lord's name in vain, that we are not allowed to mention Lo tisach shmo rashav, that one cannot mention God's name in vain. Now, what does that mean? That practically, halachically, means that one cannot mention the name of God the way God is mentioned in the Torah, or the way God is mentioned in prayers, right? So we have the name of God, Ado, and then Nai, name that we're all familiar with, that when we read the Torah, we mention, when we say a prayer, we mention it, when we say a blessing, we mention it. Well, that name, being the name of God, is not a name we can just mention as we want. Now, there are multiple reasons for that. Reason number one is because we respect God. And just like I go to the doctor and I don't call him by his first name because he's my doctor, so I say doctor. God also is not to be treated like any Joe and Schmo. He's God. So we respect his name. We don't call his name in vain. That's number one. There's a deeper reason of why we don't, Kabbalistic reason really, why we don't mention God's name in vain. That's because God's name is not just a name. God's name is a channel of energy. When we say God's name, the name that we just mentioned, Ado, and then Nai, we are channeling a certain level of divine energy to the world. And by the way, each name has a different type of energy. Some names are energies of severity, of justice, like the name Elohim. And I'm saying Kim, not him, again, out of respect for God. But the full name is Elo and then him. But that's a name of justice that channels justice to the world, God's justice to the world. And then you have a name like Kel. Again, I'm saying Kel and not the E-L. And that's because, again, out of respect. But their name is a name of kindness. Now, when we mention those names, we are drawing down something. Now, the drawdown of God's energy can just happen just for fun. It's got to be focused. It's got to be well calculated. It's got to be for specific reasons. We don't play around with God's energy. Just like you want to play around with your electricity at home. You have to be careful with it. So same here, mystically, we don't mention God's name in vain because we are careful about how we draw down that divine energy that this specific name that I want to mention is drawing down.